In 2018, an abandoned palace on Spain's Golden Mile hid gold doorknobs beneath thick dust. Once the $300 million summer fortress of a desert prince turned billionaire king. King Fahd built his own White House far from Saudi Arabia, but marble and fortune couldn't blanket scandal, devastating gambling losses, a secret Christian wife, addictions, and the threat of exile. How did the richest Arab ruler, who rose from poverty to $25 billion, end in ruin, and why does his palace now rot in silence? The story begins decades earlier, with a boy whose father struggled to find dates to eat. In the early 1920s, Riyadh was a city of mud walls and open desert, its people scraping by on what little the land could give. Fahd bin Abdulaziz was born here around 1923, long before Saudi Arabia appeared on any map. His father, Abdulaziz, would later remind foreign visitors that they once rode donkeys and struggled to find enough dates to eat. This was a world where power meant little without food, and fortunes rose and fell with the seasons. Abdulaziz's ambitions stretched beyond the horizon. He united scattered tribes, forging a kingdom in 1932 through alliances and force. But even as king, he could not escape the memory of hunger. The family's fortunes turned in 1938 when oil gushed from the sands near Dammam. In a single generation, camels and mud brick homes gave way to convoys of American engineers and the promise of riches buried deep underground. Fahd was the eldest son of Hassa bint Ahmed al-Sudairi, the favorite wife whose influence would echo through the royal lineage. Abdulaziz's devotion to Hassa was so complete that he compelled his own brother to divorce her, ensuring the Sudairi sons would hold a special place in the new dynasty. The Sudairi Seven, Fahd, and his full brothers would become the most powerful bloc in the kingdom, their names synonymous with authority and succession. As a boy, Fahd watched his father transform a scattered desert into a nation fueled by oil. He came of age in a household where new money mixed uneasily with old customs. By the late 1940s, the royal family's fortunes swelled with each barrel shipped overseas. American oil men brought blueprints and modern ideas, but the memory of scarcity lingered in every decision. By 1988, Fahd's personal wealth reached $18 billion, making him the second richest person in the world at the time. Forbes would later estimate his fortune at $25 billion. The boy who once heard his father speak of donkeys and dates now presided over a kingdom of marble palaces, private jets, and gold-plated telephones. Yet beneath the surface, the old insecurities remained, shaping every display of power, every act of extravagance. The leap from poverty to petro-wealth was dizzying, and its effects would ripple through Fahd's life and legacy. Monte Carlo, in the spring of 1962, was a world away from the dust and hunger of Fahd's childhood. Crystal chandeliers glowed above green felt tables, and the air carried the quiet intensity of fortunes made and lost in a single night. At the center of it all, Prince Fahd, heir to one of the world's fastest-growing fortunes, staked his reputation on the turn of a card. By sunrise, the scale of his loss was clear. £7 million vanished across the tables, a sum that echoed through the corridors of power back in Riyadh. The Western press caught wind, and for the first time, the House of Saud's private indulgences became public scandal. The news reached King Faisal, who had spent years cultivating an image of piety and discipline for Saudi Arabia. The custodian of Islam's holiest sites could not be seen as a man whose brother gambled away more than most of his subjects would see in a lifetime. Faisal summoned Fahd to the palace. The encounter that followed left no room for misunderstanding. Faisal struck Fahd across the face, a gesture that spoke not only of personal disappointment, but of the threat this behavior posed to the family's grip on power. The slap was more than punishment. It was a warning. The kingdom's stability depended on the illusion of restraint, and the illusion had cracked in full view of the world. For Fahd, the sting of that moment lingered, but so did the thrill of risk. He did not stop gambling. He had tasted the freedom that oil money could buy, and he was unwilling to give it up. Not for his brother, not for the throne, not for the expectations of a nation. The episode set a pattern that would repeat in the years ahead: public scandal, private discipline, and a defiant return to excess. The press coverage of the Monte Carlo loss marked the first time Fahd's private vices threatened the carefully guarded image of royal virtue. Yet, instead of retreating, he pressed on, convinced that wealth could shield him from consequence. The world had changed, and so had the rules. For the House of Saud, the stakes were no longer measured in dates and donkeys, but in headlines and the shifting tides of global opinion. October 1974. The French Riviera sparkled with the last heat of summer, but inside the casino halls of Cannes, the air was thick with risk. Prince Fahd, joined by his brothers Sultan and Abdul Rahman, moved through the velvet ropes and crystal lights with the confidence of men who believed fortune could not touch them. At their side was Adnan Khashoggi, the arms dealer whose connections stretched from Riyadh to Washington. The tables were set for spectacle, but no one expected what came next. That night, Fahd lost $6 million in a single sitting. The sum was staggering even for a prince, money that could build a hospital or feed a village, swept away by the turn of a card. French photographers, tipped off by whispers of Saudi royalty, captured images of the brothers under the casino lights. The story broke fast. Time magazine splashed the headline across its pages, and the scandal echoed from Paris to Riyadh. The press did not spare details: the piles of chips, the laughter that faded into tension, the moment the croupier swept the last of Fahd's fortune from the table. For the House of Saud, the damage was not just financial. The family's reputation, carefully guarded for decades, was now fodder for tabloids and broadsheets. In Riyadh, ministers read the reports with growing alarm. The future king of Saudi Arabia, custodian of the two holy mosques, had become a symbol of excess and recklessness on the world stage. The Western press dissected every move, every rumor, questioning whether the oil-rich monarchy could police its own. Fahd's circle scrambled for answers. Behind closed doors, discussions turned to damage control. King Hassan II of Morocco, a friend to the Saudi royals, offered a discreet solution: a private palace where Fahd could gamble out of sight, far from the lenses of the European press. The offer was tempting, but the stain of the Cannes disaster could not be so easily washed away. The French newspapers ran stories for weeks, and the Time article cemented the scandal in international memory. For Fahd, the night in Cannes was more than a personal loss. It exposed the limits of wealth as a shield. The world's eyes were now trained on him, and every indulgence risked becoming tomorrow's headline. The stakes had shifted. The prince who once believed himself untouchable had been humbled, not by his family, but by the cold mathematics of chance and the relentless curiosity of the press. December 1967. A Christmas party in Jeddah brought together diplomats, royals, and the city's rising elite. Among the guests was Janan Harb, a 19-year-old Palestinian Christian whose family had recently arrived from Ramallah. Prince Fahd, then in his late 40s and serving as Saudi Arabia's interior minister, noticed her across the room. Their conversation that night began a relationship that would be hidden from the world for decades. By March 1968, Janan had converted to Islam. The two were married in a discreet ceremony, away from the scrutiny of the royal court and the conservative society that surrounded it. For the next 2 years, Janan lived between palaces in Jeddah and London, experiencing a life of luxury few could imagine. Yet every comfort was shadowed by secrecy. Fahd's position as a senior prince and her origins as a Christian outsider made their union dangerous. The risk was not only political, but personal. Any exposure could ignite a scandal that might threaten Fahd's standing in the House of Saud. Janan later described a marriage filled with affection, but marked by fear. She became pregnant 3 times, but each time, Fahd pressed for an abortion. The prospect of a child born from a union that defied family and faith was too great a risk. Each decision was made behind locked doors, in whispered conversations, with no one to confide in. Janan was not just a wife in hiding, she was a secret that could not be allowed to exist in the public eye. Tensions inside the royal family grew. Fahd's brothers, including Salman, blamed Janan for his growing dependency on methadone, a medication he began using for chronic pain. The family viewed her as an outsider whose presence threatened not only Fahd's reputation, but the unity of the Sudairi brothers. In early 1970, the pressure reached its breaking point. Janan was summoned and told she had 2 hours to leave the country. She was 23 years old, penniless, and forced to abandon everything she owned. The palace doors closed behind her, and her name was erased from the official record. For decades, Janan lived in exile, first in Beirut, then the United States, and eventually London. She rebuilt her life, but the memory of those years, and the abrupt end of her marriage, never faded. In 2003, she confronted Fahd's son, Prince Abdulaziz, in London, claiming he had promised to honor Fahd's lifelong support for her. The dispute reached the High Court, where a British judge awarded her more than £15 million and the deeds to 2 luxury apartments in Chelsea. The judgment did not rule on the marriage itself, but it forced the House of Saud private history into the public record. Janan Harb's story remains contested, shaped by her own testimony, legal battles, and the silence of a royal family determined to keep its secrets. Her account is a reminder that even in a world of immense wealth, the cost of protecting an image can be measured in lost years, broken promises, and lives lived in the shadows. October 1969. Official statements in Riyadh described Prince Fahd's absence as medical leave, but his true location was an open secret among the inner circle. London's casinos and the private salons of Spain became his refuge, far from the watchful eyes of his brothers and the court. As weeks turned into months, the silence from Fahd grew louder. King Faisal, determined to restore order and his nephew's obedience, sent Omar al-Sakaf, his trusted envoy, with a series of hand-delivered letters. Each message urged Fahd to return, invoking duty, family, and the fragile balance of the royal house. Fahd read the letters but offered no reply. The envoy returned to Riyadh empty-handed, only to be dispatched again with firmer language and a warning of consequences. Still, Fahd refused. The correspondence between the king and his wayward nephew became a test of wills, played out across continents. Behind palace walls, ministers debated the risks. Removing Fahd from his post as deputy prime minister was now a real possibility, and whispers of an official dismissal began to circulate through the corridors of power. For Fahd, exile was not just a matter of geography. Each day, away from Riyadh, increased the risk that his absence would become permanent. The family's unity, so carefully constructed by Abdulaziz, teetered on the brink. The stakes were no longer limited to personal reputation or fleeting scandal. The future of the Sudari Seven and the order of succession itself hung in the balance. The standoff dragged into the spring of 1970. King Faisal's letters grew more urgent, but Fahd's silence remained unbroken. Plans were drawn for his removal, and the possibility of a public rupture within the House of Saud became more than a distant threat. Yet, as fate would have it, the next act would unfold not in exile, but in the aftermath of an assassination. For now, Fahd's defiance in exile cast a long shadow over Riyadh, and the question of who would rule next grew more uncertain with each passing week. Inside the royal palaces, family life unfolded on a scale few could comprehend. Fahd married at least 13 times, a number whispered among palace staff and noted in genealogical records. The marriages reflected more than tradition, they were alliances, each with its own set of demands and expectations. 8 of these unions ended in divorce, leaving behind a trail of broken connections and quiet departures. Only 5 wives bore children, and from these relationships came 6 sons and 4 daughters, each carrying the weight of their father's name and fortune. The family tree stretched across continents, with children attending private schools in London, Paris, and Geneva. Yet, for all the outward splendor, the bonds inside the household were often fragile. Rivalries simmered between siblings, fueled by questions of inheritance and favor. The palace corridors echoed with the footsteps of children and the whispered anxieties of mothers whose positions could change overnight. Among all his wives, one stood apart, Jawhara al-Ibrahim. Her presence in Fahd's later years was unmistakable. She was the mother of his youngest son, Abdulaziz, and her influence extended beyond the private apartments. Jawhara's family, the al-Ibrahims, rose in prominence alongside her, securing business deals and government contracts that further entwined their fortunes with the House of Saud. For Fahd, Jawhara represented stability in a world where alliances shifted as quickly as the desert wind. Yet even Jawhara's favored status could not shield her from the uncertainties of royal life. The household operated under its own code. Loyalty was prized, but security was never guaranteed. Children learned early that affection and privilege were not always linked, and that the favor of the king could be as fleeting as it was powerful. In this world of marble halls and golden gates, family was both sanctuary and battleground, shaped by the same forces that built and threatened to undo the dynasty itself. On the southern edge of Marbella, where the Mediterranean air drifts through groves of pine and orange, a marble vision rose from the earth in the 1980s. The estate stretched across 200 acres, a scale that dwarfed even the grandest villas of Spain's Golden Mile. At its heart stood a building that seemed at once familiar and impossible, a full-scale replica of the White House, its neoclassical facade rendered in pale stone, columns gleaming in the sunlight. But this was not Washington. This was Marmar Palace, named for the Sanskrit word for marble, and it belonged to the richest man the Arab world had ever known. The project was conceived as more than a summer retreat. It was a monument to everything that oil wealth could command. Gold fixtures adorned every room, from the grand entrance hall to the private apartments. The doors, heavy and cold to the touch, were fitted with handles plated in gold. Chandeliers hung from ceilings 20 feet high, their crystals catching the light in 1,000 directions. The main residence was only the beginning. Surrounding it, a constellation of luxury villas housed guests and members of the royal entourage, each with its own pool and manicured garden. Fahd's ambitions extended to every corner of the estate. There was a private hospital, equipped with operating rooms and intensive care suites, ready to serve at a moment's notice. A helipad was built for arrivals by air, while a fleet of Mercedes limousines waited in the shaded garages. The palace grounds included a mosque with marble floors and gold calligraphy, where prayers echoed softly through the corridors. Fountains and pools lined the walkways, their water drawn from underground reservoirs and filtered through imported stone. No detail was spared, no expense questioned. The original construction cost soared past £300 million, a figure that, for most, would be unimaginable. But for Fahd was simply the price of privacy and prestige. In 2002, the estate underwent a further renovation, costing another €108 million. The upgrades brought new technology, enhanced security, and layers of luxury that set the palace apart from anything else on the Costa del Sol. Local officials granted Marmar the only royal urban designation in Marbella's history, a legal status that placed it beyond the reach of ordinary zoning laws. The palace became a self-contained world, insulated from the outside by high walls and discreet guards. Marble walkways wound through palm groves and rose gardens. The kitchens could serve banquets for hundreds, yet were just as ready to prepare a single late-night meal for the king. In the main hall, a grand staircase swept upward beneath a painted dome, leading to suites where sunlight fell across silk carpets and velvet drapes. For Fahd, Marmar was more than a residence. It was a statement, a physical answer to every doubt and slight, a place where the lessons of hunger and obscurity could be buried under layers of stone and gold. Here, the boy who once listened to his father speak of donkeys and dates could survey a kingdom built not only on oil, but on the certainty that nothing was beyond reach. The White House replica did not just mimic the architecture of power, it declared that power had found a new home, far from the Potomac, on a sunlit coast where the world's fortunes converged. Each summer, Marbella braced itself for an arrival unlike any other in Europe. Advance teams swept through the city, booking up 300 hotel rooms in a single afternoon. That was only the beginning. When King Fahd came to town, he brought with him an entourage of 3,000, family, advisors, doctors, chefs, security, and servants, spilling out across the Costa del Sol. 500 locals were hired to serve the royal party each visit, their wages and tips eclipsing anything the city's seasonal workers had seen before. The impact was immediate and impossible to ignore. Municipal records from the late 1990s show that a single royal visit injected as much as €90 million into Marbella's economy. Restaurants, boutiques, and nightclubs stayed open late, sometimes all night. Patisseries reported selling out their entire stock by noon. Limousine companies renewed their fleets annually just to keep up with the demand for Mercedes sedans. Even the city's legendary nightlife bent to the king's schedule, with clubs reserving private rooms and entire dance floors for his sons and favored guests. Palace staff remember the king's generosity in concrete terms. In one summer, he tipped the staff of a single hotel €234,000, a sum that made headlines and set a record in the city's history. Waiters, bellhops, and housekeepers found themselves with windfalls that could pay off a mortgage or send a child to university. The stories traveled fast. Marbella became known across Spain as a place where fortunes could change overnight, if only for a season. Fahad's arrival was a spectacle of wealth on a scale that defied belief. He landed in a custom Boeing 747, outfitted at a cost of $150 million. The plane had its own fountain, gold-plated fixtures, and a private prayer room. On the water, the king's yacht, the Prince Abdulaziz, dominated the marina. At 482 feet, it was one of the largest private vessels in the world, boasting 2 swimming pools, a ballroom, a theater, and a hospital equipped with an intensive care unit. Local children would gather at the docks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the floating palace as it glided into port. For city officials, the king's visits were both a logistical challenge and a windfall. Police coordinated with Saudi security teams to close roads and manage crowds. Shops along the Golden Mile saw their annual profits triple in the weeks the royal family stayed. Even the city's infrastructure changed. Streetlights were upgraded, gardens replanted, and fountains repaired in anticipation of the king's arrival. The effect on Marbella was transformative. For a few weeks each year, the city became an outpost of Riyadh, its rhythms dictated by the movements of the royal party. Local businesses thrived, and the city's reputation as a playground for the world's elite was cemented. But beneath the glamour, there was an unspoken awareness that this prosperity was borrowed time. The palace stood as both a monument to unimaginable wealth and a reminder of how quickly fortunes, of families and cities alike, could change. On November 29, 1995, the world inside Marmar Palace changed forever. King Fahd suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed and unable to speak. The man who once commanded armies, built cities, and moved markets with a word could now barely move his own hand. For decades, his will had shaped the kingdom and defined the boundaries of power. Now, the throne belonged to a body that could no longer rise from its chair. Doctors arrived in silence, their faces drawn and grave. Reports from Riyadh described a king confined to a wheelchair, his speech reduced to fragments. The palace that had once echoed with laughter and music became a place of hushed voices and closed doors. Official statements spoke only of illness, but the reality was clear to those inside the royal circle. King Fahd would rule Saudi Arabia in name only for the next 10 years. In the shadow of his decline, his half-brother Abdullah stepped forward. Abdullah became the caretaker, not just of the king, but of the entire kingdom. Every decree, every meeting, every decision now passed through his hands. The balance of power shifted quietly behind gilded gates, as courtiers and ministers adjusted to a new reality. The palace in Marbella, once a symbol of unstoppable wealth, began to feel the first chill of neglect. The grandeur remained, but the force that had animated it was gone. The richest man in the Arab world, once so sure of his place in history, now watched events from behind a veil of silence and immobility. Dust thickens on the gold-plated handles, muting their shine beneath a layer of neglect. Pools that once shimmered in the Andalusian sun now hold only stagnant water, their tiles hidden under a film of algae and debris. Marble walkways, once swept daily by silent staff, are cracked and buckled, weeds pushing through the seams. Across the grand entrance, graffiti sprawls in looping colors, a signature left by those drawn to the ruins of privilege. Inside, silence lingers where music and laughter once echoed. Crystal chandeliers hang above empty halls, their brilliance dulled by years without light. Doors stand ajar, battered by wind and time, revealing rooms stripped of their treasures. The private hospital sits idle, its equipment rusting, while the mosque's calligraphy fades under layers of dust. Urban explorers recount the sense of trespassing on a forgotten world. They describe corridors littered with broken glass, staircases leading nowhere, and the heavy air of abandonment. Security guards and dogs still patrol the perimeter, but inside, decay is the only master. The palace, built to outlast its creator, has become a monument to impermanence. What was once a fortress of solitude and power is now a shell, surrendered to the elements and the curiosity of strangers. The promise of eternity, carved in marble and gold, yields to the slow, relentless work of time. In the ruins of Marmar, opulence is stripped of meaning, leaving only the echo of a vanished ambition. Today, Marmar Palace stands empty, a $300 million monument to power, secrecy, and the limits of wealth. As luxury properties across Europe sit abandoned in legal limbo, Marbella's silent White House reminds us fortunes can vanish faster than stone decays, but the consequences of unchecked power linger. Extravagance fades, but the questions it raises about legacy and accountability endure. What we choose to build and leave behind still shapes the world we inherit. Why do billionaires let their grandest dreams rot? The answer begins with the moment everything fell apart. November 29, 1995. In the private quarters of a marble palace designed to mirror the White House, King Fahd bin Abdulaziz Al Saud collapsed. At 72, the world's richest Arab monarch was surrounded by gold, servants, and the trappings of absolute power. But inside his own body, something ruptured that no doctor, no fortune, no title could repair. The stroke struck without warning. One moment, the custodian of the two holy mosques, worth an estimated $25 billion, was the most powerful man in the Arab world. The next, he could not move half his body. His speech slurred, then faded. Muscles that once gripped the levers of power now clung to life itself. Doctors rushed in. Saudi physicians worked alongside American specialists flown in for the crisis. The king was stabilized, but the verdict was clear. The damage was permanent. Diabetes, high blood pressure, years of heavy smoking, and a lifetime of excess had all conspired against him. The man who once presided over desert kingdoms, oil fields, and marble halls would never again walk unaided. First came the cane, then the wheelchair. Within days, he could barely utter a word. For the first time in decades, the palace gates in Riyadh stayed closed to the world. The news spread carefully, managed by the royal court. Official statements called it a routine checkup. Foreign diplomats whispered about the king's condition, but the palace denied rumors of crisis. Still, inside the royal family, reality set in. Fahd was now a prisoner in his own body. He could not sign documents. He could not chair meetings. He could not even rise from his bed without help. The man who had built a personal empire of palaces, jets, and yachts was now cut off from the very world he had shaped. His absence created a vacuum. For years, King Fahd had ruled not just with wealth, but with presence. A hand on every deal, every policy, every family feud. Now, ministers and princes gathered outside his room, waiting for instructions that would never come. The marble corridors echoed with uncertainty. In public, the king's image was carefully maintained. Brief footage on Saudi television showed him sipping coffee or raising his hand. But those who visited found him barely aware of their presence, unable to follow conversation, his eyes searching for words that would not arrive. Outside the palace, the world kept moving. Oil prices rose and fell. The kingdom's enemies grew bolder, but inside, time seemed to stop. The man who had crowned himself custodian of the two holy mosques, who had once called Marbella the land blessed by Allah, now faced the slow, silent unraveling of everything he had built. In that moment, the future of a dynasty and the fate of a $300 million palace hung in the balance. Nothing would ever be the same. For nearly a decade, the kingdom functioned without its king. In Riyadh, Fahd's portrait still hung in every ministry and embassy, his name spoken in official prayers, his signature printed on royal decrees. But behind the palace gates, power had shifted. Crown Prince Abdullah, the king's half-brother, met with ministers in private rooms and took calls from foreign leaders. He became the quiet steward of the state, guiding policy and handling crises, while Fahd lingered in the background, present in title, absent in action. State television offered only brief glimpses of the monarch. Each appearance was carefully managed. Cameras rolled as Fahd lifted a cup of coffee to his lips or nodded at assembled dignitaries. The footage lasted only seconds, enough to reassure the public that the king was still alive. When foreign leaders visited, meetings were staged for the benefit of the news. The king's hand was raised, sometimes with help. Smiles were exchanged for the cameras. The real discussions happened elsewhere, between Abdullah and the ministers who now ran the country. Inside the royal court, the choreography of power became routine. Documents requiring the king's approval were brought to his bedside. Sometimes his trembling hand traced a signature. More often, a trusted aide signed on his behalf. The machinery of monarchy continued, but the man at its center was fading. Those who visited Fahd in private described him as distant, his mind wandering, his speech reduced to fragments. He recognized old friends less and less. Conversations drifted into silence. Outside the palace, the world speculated. Diplomats in Riyadh traded rumors about the king's health. Some said he was lucid for a few minutes each day. Others claimed he no longer understood the affairs of state. Official statements dismissed such talk as lies. In public, the illusion of continuity was maintained. In private, everyone knew the truth. Fahd's physical decline was gradual and relentless. At first, he relied on a cane, shuffling through the marble corridors with difficulty. Within a year, he was confined to a wheelchair. By the early 2000s, he could barely move or speak. He spent long stretches away from Saudi Arabia, retreating to palaces in Geneva or Marbella. Sometimes he disappeared for months, leaving the kingdom to run on autopilot. The government explained his absences as medical retreats, nothing more. Abdullah's stewardship was quiet, almost invisible. He avoided the lavish parties and gambling trips that had defined Fahd's reign. Instead, he focused on stability, keeping oil flowing, managing the royal family's rivalries, containing dissent. For 10 years, the kingdom drifted between two realities, a king who lingered in the shadows and a prince who ruled without a crown. In the marble halls of the Marmar Palace in Marbella, the king's absence was felt in every empty room. The gold fixtures gleamed, the gardens were tended, but the laughter and music were gone. Servants waited for orders that never came. The palace, like the kingdom, became a monument to a man who was there and not there, alive and already fading from the world he had once commanded. August 21st, 1999. In the quiet of the Marmar Palace, news arrived from Riyadh. Prince Faisal bin Fahd, eldest son of the king, had died of a heart attack at just 54. The palace in Marbella, usually a summer refuge filled with the noise of family and staff, fell silent. King Fahd, once the center of every gathering, was now a distant figure, confined to his wheelchair, unable to travel, unable to speak more than a few words. The duty to bury a son is one of the most sacred in Islam. On that day, Fahd could do nothing. He could not return to Riyadh. He could not stand at the graveside. He could not offer comfort to his grandchildren or recite the final prayers. All the wealth in the world, all the gold and marble, could not bridge the distance between a father and his son's grave. 5 months earlier, another loss had struck. Fahd's first wife, Al-Anud bint Abdulaziz, died of kidney failure in California. The king's health had already made travel impossible. Friends and relatives recalled how the palace staff moved quietly, as if not to disturb the heavy air of mourning that settled over the estate. Letters of condolence arrived from every corner of the Arab world. Ministers and princes sent messages, but the king remained in Marbella, separated from his family by more than just miles. Eyewitnesses from the time describe a strange stillness in the palace. Servants tended the gardens and polished the gold door handles, but the routines felt hollow. In the evenings, the king would sit by the window, looking out over the Mediterranean, his face unreadable. Some said he wept. Others said he simply stared, lost in memories. The palace, built as a monument to power and pleasure, became a place of waiting and regret. In Riyadh, the funeral for Prince Faisal was attended by thousands, royals, officials, citizens. The absence of the king was not explained. no official statement was made. In the mosque, prayers were recited for the dead and for the living. In Marbella, the king's aides gathered in hushed circles, unsure what to say or do. A father had outlived his son, unable to fulfill the last rites. For a man who had built an empire, this was a loss beyond repair. The palace on the Golden Mile, once alive with celebration, now echoed with silence. The king's world had grown smaller with each passing year, each loss. Outside, the Spanish sun shone on marble terraces and empty pools. Inside, grief settled into the walls. In the years that followed, the king's visits to Marbella grew shorter, his health more fragile. But the memory of that day, August 21st, 1999, remained, a private sorrow that no amount of power could erase. In 1986, King Fahd took on a new title, custodian of the two holy mosques. With it came a pledge to spread Wahhabi Islam far beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. Billions of dollars flowed from Riyadh into the world, building thousands of mosques and Islamic schools from Jakarta to Johannesburg, from Paris to Los Angeles. The money was meant to project influence, to shape hearts and minds, to keep the faith strong at home and abroad. But money, once released, is hard to control. Some of the schools and charities funded with Saudi oil wealth became breeding grounds for a new kind of zealotry. Young men, shaped by strict doctrine, learned to see the world in black and white. The kingdom's generosity cast a long shadow. 15 years later, that shadow reached back home. On September 11, 2001, the world learned that 15 of the 19 hijackers who brought down the Twin Towers were Saudi nationals. Osama bin Laden, once a favored son of the kingdom, had turned his fury on the West and on the royal family itself for allowing American troops on Saudi soil. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The playboy king who gambled millions in Monte Carlo had also built the ideological infrastructure that extremists would later exploit. The money that built marble mosques now stained the reputation of the House of Saud. The reckoning came quickly. In May 2003, 3 car bombs ripped through a housing complex in Riyadh, killing 35 people. The attackers were Saudis. The victims were mostly foreigners, engineers, teachers, children. The message was clear. The violence that had once seemed distant could no longer be contained. In the aftermath, government media quoted King Fahd, "Strike with an iron fist," but the king could barely speak. His health had deteriorated so far that he could not address his people, could not command his ministers, could not offer comfort to the wounded. The real response came from Crown Prince Abdullah, who ordered mass arrests, shut down suspect charities, and tightened control over religious funding. For years, the kingdom had exported its faith, believing it could shape the world from afar. Now, the fires it helped kindle burned at home. The palace in Marbella, built as a retreat from the burdens of power, became a kind of exile. Fahd spent long stretches there, far from the chaos of Riyadh, surrounded by gold and marble, but haunted by news from home. The cost of influence, once measured in oil and prestige, was now counted in lives lost and trust betrayed. The king remained a ghost, his voice quoted in newspapers, his image broadcast on television, but his power slipping away with every headline. On the edge of Marbella's Golden Mile, a palace rises behind iron gates and cypress trees, a monument to ambition, built not for shelter, but to dazzle. The Marmar Palace, later called El Rocio, stretches across 200 acres of marble terraces, manicured lawns, and gold-plated doors. King Fahd did not want just another royal retreat. He wanted a replica of the White House, carved from stone and sunlight, a place where power could be measured in columns and fountains. Construction began in the 1980s, when Marbella was still a sleepy resort town. Fahd's vision reshaped the coast. He ordered architects to study the details of Washington's most famous address, then build it bigger, brighter, and with more marble. The result was a palace that seemed to float between worlds. Inside, chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with gold leaf. The grand staircase curled above a marble fountain, water catching the light in the silence of afternoon. In one wing, a private clinic stood ready for any emergency, a hospital disguised as a villa, staffed with doctors on call for the king and his family. Nearby, a mosque welcomed hundreds during Ramadan, its minaret rising above olive trees, the call to prayer echoing across the grounds. A heliport sat at the edge of the estate, ready to receive guests arriving from Riyadh or Paris. Swimming pools shimmered under the Spanish sun, lined with blue mosaic tiles. Dozens of villas dotted the park, each reserved for a different branch of the royal family. The palace was a city unto itself. When King Fahd arrived for the summer, Marbella transformed overnight. 3,000 relatives and guests flew in, trailed by an entourage of 500 staff. 100 Mercedes cars rolled through the streets, their drivers waiting outside boutiques and restaurants. The king's friends filled the 300 hotel rooms, and the town's best shops emptied their shelves to meet the palace's demands. Local patisseries baked through the night. Fishmongers delivered their best catch to the palace kitchens. The exclusive Puerto Banú branch of El Corte Inglés opened its doors early for royal shoppers. Porters at the marina prepared for the arrival of the king's $100 million super yacht. Each summer, more than $90 million flowed into Marbella's economy. Waiters and hotel managers remember the tips. One year, a single gratuity of 234,000 euros left jaws slack and stories that would echo for decades. For the town's merchants, the king's visit was a season of miracles. The palace itself became a legend. Locals whispered about the gold fixtures, the imported marble, the private hospital where no outsider was ever treated. The mosque welcomed not only the royal family, but also the growing Muslim community of the Costa del Sol, a gesture that blurred the line between faith and spectacle. In the evenings, the gardens filled with laughter, music, and the scent of jasmine. But the grandeur was always tinged with distance. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Most residents glimpsed the palace only from afar, its white facade glowing behind hedges. For those inside, the estate offered everything: luxury, privacy, and the illusion of control. Yet beneath the surface, the palace was also a fortress against time, built to hold back the world and its troubles. As the years passed, the palace grew larger, more elaborate. In 2002, a renovation cost 120 million euros, adding new wings and restoring every inch of marble. But by then, the king's health had begun to fail. The private clinic, once a symbol of invincibility, became a necessity. The heliport, designed for grand arrivals, now stood ready for medical flights. The palace's opulence could not keep illness at bay. Still, for a few short summers, Marbella thrived under the shadow of its most extravagant guest. The streets buzzed with anticipation. Shopkeepers counted the days until the royal convoy returned. Each visit was a reminder that for all its beauty, the palace owed its life to one man's presence, and that nothing, not even marble and gold, could last forever. On May 27, 2005, King Fahd bin Abdulaziz was admitted to King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Riyadh. He arrived in a private ambulance, shielded from public view, suffering from pneumonia and water in his lungs. The man once surrounded by the world's finest doctors and endless resources now faced the limits of medicine. For weeks, his condition hovered between hope and resignation. Family members gathered in hushed corridors. The royal court released only the barest details, calling it a routine stay. But inside the hospital, the truth was unmistakable. Fahd's body, worn by decades of excess and 10 years of illness, could not recover. At 2:30 in the morning on August 1st, 2005, King Fahd died. He was 84 years old. His reign had lasted 23 years. His fortune, at its height, was estimated at $25 billion. 13 wives, palaces across 3 continents, and a name known from Los Angeles to Kuala Lumpur. Yet in the end, there were no crowds, no processions, no golden casket. His final moments came not in a marble palace or aboard a private jet, but in a hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet presence of his closest kin. Within hours, preparations began for his burial. In Wahhabi Islam, death is the great equalizer. No matter how rich, how powerful, or how beloved, all men are returned to the earth in the same way. Clerics forbade displays of grief. No eulogies, no music, no flowers. Fahd was washed, wrapped in the last robe he wore, and carried to the Imam Turki bin Abdullah Mosque. There, prayers were said not just for a king, but for a soul stripped of all rank. Then, in the heat of the Riyadh morning, his body was taken to Al-Oud Cemetery, a public burial ground where his 4 predecessors lay. No foreign dignitaries attended. Only family and Saudi citizens stood at the grave. The king was laid to rest in an unmarked plot, indistinguishable from those around it. No headstone, no inscription, just a mound of earth, soon to settle and vanish into the landscape. Far from Riyadh, news of Fahd's death reached Marbella. The city that had once pulsed with royal convoys and summer celebrations fell into mourning. For 3 days, flags flew at half-mast. The town council declared an official period of grief, honoring the man who had poured millions into the local economy. A street was named Avenida Rey Fahd. A public garden was dedicated in his name. At the gates of the Marmar Palace, a heart-shaped wreath appeared, placed by local officials as a gesture of gratitude. The mayor called him a friend of Marbella, an adopted son whose presence had changed the city's fortunes. For decades, his visits had brought a season of prosperity, 3,000 relatives, 500 staff, and the spectacle of unimaginable wealth. Now, the palace stood silent, its gold fixtures and marble halls echoing with absence. The contrast could not have been sharper. In life, Fahd lived surrounded by luxury, attended by servants, courted by presidents and princes. In death, he was buried without a marker, in the simplest of graves, as tradition demanded. In Marbella, the tributes were public and heartfelt, but in Riyadh, the king disappeared into the earth without ceremony. The man who had built a palace to rival the White House, who had reshaped a city's destiny, was now a memory, honored in Spain, humbled in Saudi Arabia, equal at last with the millions who had never known his name. Beyond the locked gates and silent avenues of the Marmar Palace, time has done what no rival or revolution could accomplish. The estate, once a living city of marble, gold, and laughter, has been left to the mercy of the Spanish sun and the slow, patient hand of decay. Dust gathers on gold door handles, dulling their shine, each one untouched for years. Corridors that once echoed with footsteps and whispered commands stand empty, their marble floors veiled in a thin film of neglect. In the great halls, chandeliers hang above silent rooms. The air is thick and unmoving, heavy with the memory of vanished summers. Faded footprints linger on staircases stained by rainwater and time. The grand staircase, once a stage for royal arrivals, now leads only to darkness. Peeling paint curls from the walls, revealing layers beneath, white and gold, now broken by age and abandonment. Windows, once polished by an army of staff, are streaked with dust and salt. Sunlight filters through, catching on motes that swirl in the stagnant air. Some panes are cracked, others shattered, letting in the wind and the occasional stray bird. In the salons, gilded moldings are scarred by graffiti. Names and symbols scrawled by unseen hands compete with the ornate designs. Each mark a reminder of how quickly opulence can be overtaken by the ordinary. The swimming pools, once a blue mirror for the Andalusian sky, have turned to murky pits. Leaves and branches float on the surface of stagnant water, thick with algae. The marble edges are chipped and stained, their clean lines softened by neglect. Gardens that once hosted parties are tangled with weeds and wild grass, swallowing the paths that led to hidden fountains. The scent of jasmine has been replaced by the sharp smell of earth and rot. In the outer villas, doors hang loose on their hinges. The sound of an occasional dog barking echoes across the grounds, a reminder that some life remains, if only to guard what is left. Guards still patrol the perimeter, but inside, the palace is left to its silence. The only footprints in the dust belong to intruders and explorers, drawn by the legend of what once was. The Marmar Palace stands as a monument to absence. Every room, every empty chair, every dust-covered surface is a record of time passing without witness. The grandeur remains, but it is hollowed out, stripped of meaning. The silence is not peaceful, it is uneasy, the kind that waits for something that will never return. In 2018, more than a decade after King Fahd's death, urban explorer Jake Parr crossed the threshold of the Marmar Palace. The estate that once hosted kings and presidents now sat in silence, its marble halls and gold-plated fixtures surrendered to dust and time. Parr's footage captured what few outsiders had seen, the aftermath of absence. A palace built for power and spectacle, left untouched by its owners, guarded only by stray dogs and silent watchmen. The decay was not just physical, it was the erosion of memory, the slow unraveling of a legacy that could not be inherited. Abandoned. The property's estimated value hovered near £300 million, yet no one came to claim it. No restoration crews arrived. No for sale sign appeared on the iron gates. The palace remained in limbo, too valuable to abandon, too personal to sell. Real estate agents in Marbella offered their own explanations. Christopher Clover, a veteran of the local market, put it simply, "Royal families do not sell their properties. They do not need the money." The logic was as cold as the marble floors. When wealth is measured in trillions, the fate of one palace is a matter of indifference. Ownership becomes symbolic, a quiet assertion of presence even in absence. The building stands, but the life that animated it is gone. The footage from Parr's exploration spread online, drawing curiosity and disbelief. Viewers saw the remnants of a vanished world, graffiti on gilded moldings, stagnant pools where children once played, chandeliers dimmed by neglect. Each image raised the same question: why let such grandeur rot? The palace was not unique in its fate. Across Europe and the Middle East, abandoned mansions and empty estates tell a similar story. Wealth accumulates, then disperses. Heirs inherit the marble, but not the impulse that built it. The parties, the summers, the man himself, these cannot be passed down. In Marbella, the Marmar Palace remains a monument to this contradiction, worth hundreds of millions, yet empty, guarded but unlived in. The gold door handles, once polished to a mirror shine, now gather dust. The gardens, once sculpted to perfection, are left to the wild. The silence is heavy, interrupted only by the distant bark of a dog or the wind through overgrown hedges. The palace endures, but its story is unfinished, a question that lingers unanswered in the quiet Spanish sun. Today, the Marmar Palace stands empty, a $300 million husk, guarded but lifeless. As fortunes multiply and mansions rise across the globe, more palaces fall silent, untouched by the hands that built them. Wealth can buy marble and gold, but it cannot buy legacy or meaning. In the end, the world remembers not the riches, but the silence left behind. What we build is never as lasting as we hope. Share your thoughts below.